A crowd gathered under the rising sun, where once a girl was auctioned. Now the judge who sold her stood shackled in her place. Her father said nothing, just handed her the floor. With a steady voice, she began to read the letters no one answered. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The horseshoes were still warm from the forge when Ezekiel Miller returned to an open door and silence. The wind had kicked dust into the cabin, but the wreckage inside was no act of weather. Chairs overturned, their legs splintered. The cast-iron pot lay cracked in the hearth. His late wife's portrait hung crooked on the wall, a line of shattered glass slicing her painted face in two. Ezekiel didn't move at first, just stood there, his broad frame unmoving in the doorway, one hand still holding the iron tongs, the other curled into a slow, silent fist. He knew something terrible had happened the moment his boots crunched over Sarah's sewing basket, its contents strewn like spilled guts across the floor. Her shawl lay folded neatly on the table, as if she had planned to step out and return. But she hadn't returned. And now there was only this hollow, cracked place, where a girl had once hummed softly while mending linens. Outside, the sun blistered down on the dry earth as Ezekiel stepped into the yard, jaw clenched so tightly his molars ached. His neighbor, old Mr. Leeds, stood at the fence line, hat clutched in trembling hands. He didn't speak, just held out a weather-beaten scrap of paper like it was burning his fingers. Ezekiel took it. Debtor Reclamation Writ, issued by County Court Authority. Seizure enacted in absence of settlement. One dependent ward reassigned to state custody as property collateral. No signature, no warning, no damn mercy. His hands began to shake, but not with fear, with the kind of still rising fury that doesn't make sound when it boils. Sarah wasn't livestock. She wasn't property. She was his daughter. His reason to keep the forge burning after Miriam passed. His light in a town that barely tolerated them, that had never forgotten his color or his silence or the fact that he outworked men half his age. And the worst part, the absolute worst part, was the name at the top of the writ, Judge Carlton Whitmore. That name hit him harder than the news itself. He remembered Whitmore at Miriam's deathbed. The man had pressed his Bible to her hand and promised Sarah would be treated like his own blood. That promise had cost him nothing. Now it cost Ezekiel everything. The sky had begun to darken by the time he saddled the mare and rode toward town. He didn't pack a weapon, not yet. But his eyes had gone cold in a way that no man, not even a judge, would soon forget. Ezekiel's rage never showed in his voice, only in what he gave up. One by one, the tools of his trade vanished. The hammer he'd used for 2 decades, gone. His anvil, etched with years of soot and sorrow, sold to a younger smith who asked no questions. Even his wedding ring, the only piece of Miriam he wore daily, was exchanged for a brittle envelope of worn banknotes. Not a soul saw him weep. He didn't allow himself the luxury. He bought land the same way most men bought firewood, quietly and in bulk. Arid, forgotten parcels at the edge of nowhere. No water, no fence lines, no neighbors, just open dirt and dust-buried secrets. Men laughed when they heard he was buying wasteland, but they didn't laugh twice. The money went fast, but Ezekiel didn't slow. He found a lawyer 3 towns over, a sharp-minded woman named Helen Brayer, who hadn't set foot in this county since she defended a schoolteacher accused of seditious thought. Ezekiel didn't care about her reputation, only her teeth. She read the writ, looked him in the eye, and said, "We'll need proof, a lot of it." He nodded once. Then he went to work gathering it. Every week, Ezekiel sat in the back of the courthouse gallery, his shoulders square, hands clasped loosely over his lap. He never spoke, he never glared. He just watched, learned, listened. He took notes with the same precision he once used forging horseshoes, dates, names, patterns. the ways Whitmore bent the law without breaking it, the way decisions landed just shy of justice. Meanwhile, Sarah, 16 and heartbreak-hardened, moved through the banker's mansion like a phantom in white. She scrubbed the baseboards beneath oil paintings of judges and landowners, men who smiled down on her with the same cold indifference as the men who'd chained her. She said nothing. She kept her eyes low. She counted every floor tile, every visit Whitmore made. The judge came often, pausing in doorways to praise her discipline. He'd touch the brim of his hat like a gentleman, smile like a priest. But Sarah could feel the truth beneath it, the possessiveness of a man who'd traded justice for control. Back in town, whispers began to stir. They noticed Ezekiel's silence. A man like him doesn't vanish into himself unless he's tending coals for something bigger. The preacher began speaking of vengeance in sheep's wool. Old men at the saloon stopped making jokes when they saw Ezekiel ride past without reins, back straight, hands calloused but still. And when, exactly 1 year to the day Sarah was taken, Ezekiel walked into the courthouse with a folder thick as a cattle brand ledger and filed a federal lawsuit. No one laughed then. The next week, federal marshals rode in on black horses. When they left, Whitmore's robes were trailing chains. But Ezekiel wasn't after chains. He was after justice, measured, deliberate, and permanent. The sun broke over the plains like a slow-burning fuse, painting the sky an angry gold as the town of Dry Creek stirred from uneasy sleep. No church bells rang. No market stalls opened. There would be no trading today, only reckoning. At the edge of the square, on the very same platform once used for livestock and condemned landholders, the auction block stood weathered but intact. Its beams were cracked, dry like old bones. A new post had been hammered into the center, and to it, wrists bound by iron cuffs and coat stripped away, sat Judge Harold Whitmore, pale, stunned, silent. He wore no robes now, only a soiled white shirt that clung to his back with the sweat of shame. His supporters gathered like buzzards at the edge of the crowd, some whispering protests, others simply stunned into muttering. His wife stood weeping, flanked by bankers and sheriffs, and all those who had once benefited from his gavel. One shouted, "This is spectacle, not justice!" Another cried, "You're no better than him!" But the tribunal had been sanctioned. The townspeople themselves had voted, and now no law, no badge or title could undo what was about to be heard. Ezekiel stood in front of the platform, unmoving, carved from the same stone that had held him upright through a year of quiet war. Beside him stood Sarah, no longer trembling, no longer in rags. She wore white again, but this white wasn't a symbol of surrender. It was sharp, clean, starched, like armor. The braid in her dark hair was tight, coiled like a whip. Her eyes never left Whitmore. A federal official marked the time. The air was tight with anticipation. But Ezekiel said nothing. Instead, Sarah unfolded a stack of yellowed letters, creases worn from countless rereads. Her voice was steady. It did not shake. To the Honorable Judge Whitmore, my name is Ezekiel Miller. You knew my wife. You swore to her you'd look after our girl. Each letter was an arrow. But your court claimed she was property. I sent 4 letters before I learned she had been sold. I came to your court, and you would not look me in the eye. I asked you to see her as a human being. You looked at her wrists instead. Each word hung heavier than the last. People stopped breathing, and when the final page fluttered down like ash, Ezekiel finally turned toward the crowd. You called her property, he said, voice low but thunderous. I called her my daughter. He paused, long enough to cut through the bone of every man and woman watching. Now, let the town decide which of us was right. And in that moment, nothing moved, not even the wind. The verdict came down without tremble or hesitation. 12 townspeople, farmers, shopkeepers, one former debtor, even a widow whose land had nearly been taken, stood shoulder to shoulder on the platform, voices unified. The verdict echoed across the square like a hymn-turned battle cry. Guilty on all counts: abuse of judicial authority, personal fraud, misuse of public trust, a fall from the very peak of power to the dirt below. The gavel didn't slam. There was no need. Judgment had already been carved into the faces of the people watching. Whitmore, once the grand voice of law in the territory, now sagged under the weight of justice finally leveled. His eyes were glassy, jaw slack with something between disbelief and grief. The punishment: 3 years of hard labor under the very statutes he had twisted for profit. No title, no privilege, no exemption. But Ezekiel wasn't done. He stepped forward from the crowd, not with rage, but with the stillness of iron cooling in water. "No prison," he said. Gasps scattered like wind in dry grass. The federal marshal leaned forward. "Mr. Miller, the court—" Ezekiel raised a hand. "Let him work in my forge. No shackles, just sweat and steel. Let him know the weight of what a man earns. Let him feel honest fire." The silence cracked wide open. Whitmore's mouth parted as if to protest, but no words came. He only nodded, slowly, like a man surrendering to something bigger than justice, something closer to mercy. And so the months turned. The judge who once signed orders from a walnut bench now struck hammers against iron beside the man he'd tried to break. At first, the townsfolk came to gawk, watching Whitmore carry coal, burn his hands, misstrike steel until his palms blistered raw. Ezekiel never mocked, never spoke more than needed. He taught him as he would an apprentice, firmly, fairly, without pity. And Whitmore, now gray-bearded and stooped, learned. He rose before sunup, stoked the forge, listened when Ezekiel spoke. The town stopped gawking. They started nodding. Meanwhile, Sarah's school opened in the old meeting hall, the one that once barred girls from entering. She filled it with books, chalk, and purpose. Girls who had been treated like shadows now stood tall and read aloud. One evening, as the fire in the smithy dimmed into embers, Ezekiel pressed something into Whitmore's calloused hand, a polished iron rod, perfectly balanced, a symbol, a final weight. "You're free to go," he said. "You've served your time." Whitmore's shoulders caved, but not from shame. Tears streaked through soot. "I saw your fire," he whispered, trembling, "and it burned me clean." Ezekiel didn't speak. He simply turned, walked into the falling dusk, and left the door open behind him. Judge Whitmore's hands had once held quills, gavels, and the weight of other men's fates. Now they blistered under tongs and hammers. At Ezekiel's forge, he wore the same leather apron as his teacher, burn-scored, soot-streaked, stiff from sweat and fire. The clang of iron on steel rang through the mornings, relentless as guilt. Every spark that flew seemed to hiss his sins back at him. Ezekiel never shouted, never shamed. He taught with patience, not pity. "Hold it steady, Judge," he'd say evenly, correcting Whitmore's grip. The name was not mockery, only memory. But the town did not forget. At the well, women fell silent when he passed, tightening their shawls and turning their faces. At the general store, men shifted away, muttering low. Once a child stared too long and tugged on her mother's dress, asking, "Why does that old man look like he's crying on the inside?" Whitmore heard it. He always heard it. But he never answered. He swept the forge floor without being asked, fixed the hinge on Ezekiel's barn gate. Never once walked into town alone. One morning he mishandled a glowing horseshoe. It clattered off the anvil, landed near his boot, and his hands jerked back, trembling. Ezekiel stepped in, reaching instinctively, and Whitmore recoiled, eyes wide. "I thought you'd strike me," he whispered. Ezekiel paused, the horseshoe smoking between them. "That's what you would have done," he said quietly. "Not me." The words hit harder than any hammer. Whitmore nodded once and said nothing, but his breath caught like a boy who'd just been scolded by someone he wished would forgive him. That night, long after Ezekiel had banked the fire and gone to bed, Whitmore returned alone to the square. Lantern in hand, he approached the auction block, the same cracked plank platform where Sarah Miller had once stood, in shackles, beneath his judgment. He set the lantern beside him, pulled a pocket knife from his coat, and with slow, shaking hands, he began to carve. The wood resisted at first, but he pressed harder, each stroke echoing into the night. When dawn came, townsfolk gathered as usual, but this time they stopped and stared. Carved into the old timber in fresh, deep cuts were 7 words. "I sold dignity. He gave it back." No one knew when it appeared, but no one ever touched it again. The letter arrived without warning. No return address, no handwriting. Just a deep red wax seal pressed onto the thick parchment envelope, bearing the unmistakable imprint of a gavel split down the middle. Sarah found it on the front step of the schoolhouse she had built, nestled beneath the morning paper, as if placed gently, almost reverently. She opened it cautiously. Inside were 20 pages, typed, notarized, and initialed on every corner in a once familiar hand. Judge Whitmore's. Line by line, his voice unfolded like a dying man's prayer. He named every bribe he had taken, every ruling he'd twisted for profit or favor, every innocent man jailed to make room for a donor's nephew. One paragraph, folded into the center like a hidden wound, admitted the deliberate fabrication of the debtor reclamation writ used to take Sarah from Ezekiel. Sarah's hands shook. She stared at the fire in the school's old iron stove. "Let it die," she muttered. "Let it all die with him." But Ezekiel didn't move. He read the entire confession twice without speaking, then tucked it back into its envelope. When Sarah asked what he would do, he simply said, "What's right?" By week's end, the confession sat on the desk of the federal judge now stationed in the county seat. What followed was swift and brutal. Federal agents arrived in black wagons, fanning out like hounds. Ledgers were seized, vaults emptied. Arrest warrants bloomed like thorns. The town that once whispered about Ezekiel's silence now buzzed with louder revelations. Sheriff Delancey suspended. Banker Wright indicted. 3 councilmen removed in disgrace. Families who had lost property and children under dubious rulings began to come forward, some in rage, others in relief. Then came the trial. Whitmore, this time, was no longer the defendant of a local hearing. He stood in a federal courtroom, stripped of title, reputation, and the fragile anonymity hard labor once afforded him. He looked tired, not because of age, but because he had finally stopped running from what he was. Then Ezekiel took the stand. He confessed. He said calmly, "He worked in my forge without complaint. He changed. That doesn't erase what he did, but don't bury a man already reborn." The judge listened without blinking. When the verdict came, his voice was flat but clear. "You're the only reason I'm not sentencing him." The heat that day was unnatural, heavy, buzzing like a warning in the air. Dust swirled around the town's main road as if stirred by something more than wind. From the far ridge, a black carriage rolled in, pulled by a team of high-blooded grays that didn't belong in a place like this. Inside sat Giles Hardwick, silver-tipped cane leaning against his knee, black gloves hiding the fingers that had signed away dozens of lives with a flick of ink. He stepped down like a man entering a room he already owned. Hardwick hadn't been seen since the scandal, since his name surfaced in Whitmore's confession as the original buyer in Sarah's assignment. But men like him don't disappear. They regroup. He hadn't come for Sarah. He hadn't come for revenge. Not directly. This time he carried permits, deeds, and a map. And on that map was a straight black line, right through the center of Ezekiel's land. The Trans-Western Spur, he called it. Progress. He walked into Ezekiel's forge like it was a tent at a trade fair. "I'll pay you double what the land is worth," he said. Then, when Ezekiel didn't answer, "Triple, and you can keep the blacksmith name for whatever shack you move to next." Ezekiel never looked up from his anvil, so Hardwick switched tones. "Refuse, and I'll have the council condemn it as an obstruction. I'll make it disappear." What he didn't expect was Whitmore, aproned, soot-streaked but proud, stepping out from the back of the shop. "He's not the only one you'll have to raise." Hardwick froze, expression souring like curdled cream. "You?" Whitmore's voice was steady. "I let you poison me once. Never again." Within a week, it escalated. Hardwick filed motions, paid off 2 new council members, hired a private guard company from the city, their coats too clean and guns too polished for a place like this. But on the morning they came to tear the forge down, they found Ezekiel waiting in the road, hammer in hand, leather apron on, standing not in defiance, but in finality. And behind him, farmers with pitchforks, shopkeepers, the preacher, Sarah, Whitmore, children, elders, not yelling, not threatening, just standing, like a wall of heat-hardened iron, forged in fire, cooled in patience. Hardwick stepped from his carriage and looked at the crowd. For the first time in his life, Giles Hardwick knew what it meant to be unwelcome. The heat of summer had given way to the slow, golden hush of early autumn, and for the first time in years, the town breathed without tension. The tracks that were meant to slice through Ezekiel's land curved now along the far western edge of the hills, out of sight, out of reach. Giles Hardwick, forced to divert the railroad and eat his losses, vanished from the county. He left behind only a name people spat at and a contract with no teeth. Progress, it seemed, had learned to bend. Ezekiel didn't gloat. He returned to his forge like always, sleeves rolled, sweat on brow, and hammer singing against steel. But the quiet victory echoed louder than any speech. Sarah's school expanded, its walls painted with sunflowers and bluebirds, her voice filling its halls with poetry, arithmetic, and the history they refused to forget. Parents who once stayed silent now sat in her classrooms on Sundays, listening to the very children who'd once been overlooked recite aloud, confident, unashamed. And where the auction block once stood, dry-rotted, splintered, soaked in memory, now rose a monument of iron, forged by Ezekiel, plated with dark steel and engraved with rows of names, each letter hammered in by hand. The monument bore no podium. It needed none. It spoke for itself. "These were not slaves," one inscription read. "They were stolen, and they came home." Whitmore, hunched and silver-bearded, worked quietly beside Ezekiel in the forge. He limped now, hand stiff from years of labor, but he smiled when he stoked the coals. When tourists passed through and asked who he was, he'd wipe his hands on his apron and nod toward Ezekiel. "That man saved me," he'd say. "I just returned the favor." Then came Ezekiel's 60th. The town gathered under the copper light of a cloudless afternoon, not out of duty, but devotion. Children from Sarah's school performed songs, recited poems about freedom and fire. And then, with her hands shaking just slightly, Sarah pulled back a linen cloth to reveal a sculpture beneath, a statue of her father, life-sized in iron and bronze. He stood with shoulders squared, weathered hands holding a young girl's hand, eyes fixed on a stylized flame beside them. The plaque read, "When justice failed, a father made his own." Ezekiel didn't speak. He stood, hands behind his back, jaw clenched against emotion. But the way Sarah leaned into his side said everything. The town stood still, not out of fear, not out of guilt, but reverence. And long after Ezekiel was gone, they kept the forge hot, the school open, and the monument polished, because they knew what the world sometimes forgets. Justice is not always written in law. Sometimes it's forged.